I'm one of the people who believes that before drugs and alcohol caused a lot of suffering in my life, they actually perhaps saved my life and alleviated a lot of the suffering that I was already in. So I have this mixed relationship of actually I have some gratitude for booze and for drugs. And my experience was, I think I heard in AA once, I didn't have a drink the first day of kindergarten, but I needed one. And I may have actually had a drink in kindergarten. As a kid, I felt somewhat actively suicidal, and just like the pain, the confusion, the dukkha, what we call it in Buddhism, the dukkha of life was already pretty strong. And I had a suicidal ideation of wanting to get out of the pain that I was in. And I think because my father was working hospice and working with dying people, and death was around and sort of normalized, and also reincarnation was what I was taught, when I inquired, or somehow I had believed that death was somewhat of a relief, that it wasn't the end, but that it was part of an ongoing process. And so in my immature child mind, I wanted out. And it was more of a kind of the cartoons where, whatever it is, the coyote gets killed every cartoon. Roadrunner is a murderer. And that coyote's always dying, but he's always there again. And I think in my childlike mind, there was this sort of like, I could die, but I'd be here again. And when I started drinking and using at a very young age, I started smoking pot when I was about 7, and which is amazing to me. I have a daughter who's going to turn 7 next month, and I look at her, I'm just like, you're not smoking pot. But I was, and already starting to steal and starting to lie. And when I started getting high, it took some of the pain away. Some of the confusion away, and I liked it a lot. And it was a lot of fun growing up in the late 70s and early 80s and discovering punk rock and a community that I felt part of, and that expressed the angst that I felt, expressed the anger, the frustration, that critiqued our society in what I think is a wise critique. I don't know how long it was good. For me, consequences started pretty early. I started getting arrested, I think the first time I think I was 5 or 6 when I burned down the field behind the house. And that was my first sort of pseudo arrest, where I got not taken to the police department, but the fire department. And men in uniform chastised me for trying to burn down the neighborhood. It wasn't much of a neighborhood. I was actually in the Santa Cruz Mountains, so it was like burn down the mountain. But started smoking pot whenever I could, drinking my mom's booze and my dad's booze. And my dad had a lot of drugs, a lot of like acid in the freezer, and my mom at one point had, I think she was dealing mushrooms, and so she had these grocery bags full of mushrooms. And my sister, who's a couple years older than me, we used to get high together, and I was like, what is that? That's not weed. What is it? I was about 10 years old. And she said, well, it's kind of like weed, but you don't smoke it, you eat it. And she said it tastes disgusting, but it'll get you super high. And so at 10 years old, me and my friend Toby, who I had met on my T-ball, and it was like me and this guy were like, just, you know how that is. When you're an adult or when you're a kid, you can pick out the other person in the room that gets high. And we're just like, we had our skateboards, and we're like, do you get high? Like, yeah, let's get high. So me and Toby started eating mushrooms, and by the time my mom figured it out, we'd eaten like a couple of ounces of mushrooms, and just tripping our 10-year-old balls off in the redwoods in Santa Cruz, and started eating acid at 11. And I think I was about 12 years old when I discovered cocaine. And I discovered cocaine because I came home one day and there was this white powder in the bathroom, and I thought it was powdered soap. And I washed my hands with an 8-ball. And my mom and my 14-year-old sister got so fucking pissed that I knew that was something valuable. And that was something that I had to try as soon as I could. And so then I found the mirror and started, experimenting with cocaine. And I started getting arrested by the police at 11. I was in and out of juvenile hall all through my teen years, junior high school. I started getting sent to recovery, like drug diversion classes at like 13, 14. Started getting sent to 12-step meetings, Alcoholics Anonymous. I don't have a very clear memory of my impression of AA, of just more like a general sense that there was two things going on there that I wanted nothing to do with. First of all, I wasn't done at all. I was just in trouble. But also, I just had the sense that like it was adults, and adults are the enemy. So I'm not going to listen to anything and they're talking about God. Strike two. Like I want to have nothing to do with these people. Some sort of religious adult cult, I don't know. I can't remember wanting to stop until I was about 16. But by the time I was 16, and I had started smoking crack on a almost, regular daily basis, and drinking alcoholically, drinking in the mornings and throughout the day. I didn't really know that I was an alcoholic because alcohol was like, a warm-up event, and then a sort of companion, and then a go to sleep. So it was a very big part, but it was never the main course. Like alcohol for me was something that just accompanied drug use. Not that I think that there's much of a difference, but I guess at about 16 I started to realize that my relationship to drugs and booze was problematic, that it was no longer solution. It was no longer getting me out of pain, but it was temporarily getting me out of pain, but it was causing more and more suffering in my life, and getting incarcerated over and over, and just the pain of crack addiction that was just this awful feeling every day of coming down and jonesing and having to drink myself to sleep or to oblivion, or and starting to, and I can remember for whatever reason I had an attitude towards IV drug users of like, well, I'm a smoker, like I'm not a junkie, I smoke shit. and then starting to inject drugs, and just feeling like, oh, yep, I'm totally one of them, totally an addict. And once I started injecting drugs, I'm like, what was I fucking wasting all of that cocaine? Smoking it is way better to shoot it. And the arrests got more serious, and not just possession, but some violent felonies and some burglaries, and the consequences started to look scarier and scarier. It wasn't juvenile hall for a couple days, but it was looking like youth authority and prison for years, and so the combination of that fear of long-term incarceration and the personal inner suffering, just the dukkha of being strung out, and came some interest, some willingness in trying to stop, and in the beginning that thing that so many of us do of like, well, I'll just smoke weed and drink booze, and that'll be like almost like sobriety. And you just get off of the hard drugs. So the end for me came, or close to the end came for me in May of 1988, where I think it was about 11 a.m., 10, 11 a.m., where I had woken up in a friend's garage and started to drink vodka and fruit punch breakfast. And, that was preparation for then committing some crimes to get some drugs. And my friend and I broke into a car, stole a stereo, and then were seen kind of breaking into this car by an off-duty police officer who chased us, and I ended up ditching the stereo and ended up in this used car lot where I tried to hide underneath the car, but I'm not certain, but I have a feeling that I wasn't completely concealed underneath the car, like maybe my legs were kind of sticking out, or because he just sort of grabbed me and dragged me out of the car, and I had to hold out my knife, and I had this sort of inner, I'm going to stab this guy that's chasing me, and he said, I'm an off-duty police officer, and I just lost the courage to stick him, and sort of went with him and was arrested, and it was in a jail cell in juvenile hall, and that suicidal feeling that I had, always had, but that the, life of addiction had sort of kept a little bit at bay, or some might say that I was kind of trying to kill myself with the drugs and alcohol the whole time, but being in that holding cell, kind of just feeling like suicide is the answer. This feeling of I have failed at life, at survival, at nothing has worked, and I can't stop, and I'm going to end up in prison, and it's just going to get worse. And this feeling that I had of it's just hopeless. And then doing a sort of pseudo-suicide attempt in the holding cell where I was slamming my head against the concrete wall, and they put me in the rubber room, and that change of perspective came. I think that pretty much until that point I was blaming everyone else, and maybe certainly kind of antisocial, almost sociopathic, where I could cause harm and not really regret it very deeply. I didn't have a lot of shame, or I had it all justified. But that sitting in that room, there was just a shift where I just couldn't hold up the denial or the charade or the and I woke up to oh fuck, I did this. It's not them. I put myself in this situation. Which came a real flood of shame, of deep regret, but also a little bit of hope. A little bit of like, if I got myself in this situation, when I felt like a victim, then I felt like there was nothing I could do. But when I felt like some responsibility, like, oh, maybe there's something to be done. Maybe there is some action to take to get out of this, perhaps. And two things happened. One was that H&I meetings came in, hospitals and institutions, both Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And in the AA group, they were young-ish guys, early 20s guys. And one of them I knew from the streets, and that helped actually to have a peer and somebody that I knew wasn't just like some Bible-thumping narc or something. But so that helped actually. And they weren't really talking, I mean, they read the stuff and I knew it talked about God, but these guys were talking about, like, being sober's fun. Like, we went to an AA dance last weekend and we all got laid. Like, that's what they were selling. Sounds all right to me. And then I was speaking with my father, and saying, like, I kind of, I need help, and he explained to me on some level about his own reason why he practiced meditation. I grew up with, he was a meditator, he was a teacher, all of that stuff. But he said, I used to be an addict. And my spiritual practice and my meditation and my all of my work, my service, all of this, is some level, it's how I replaced my addiction. I replaced my addiction with spiritual practice, and he was somebody who, he used to be strung out on heroin. He was somebody who was like, well, you still smoke weed and drink and take acid. Like, you don't seem to be in recovery. But he's like, but on his level he had replaced his heroin addiction with a meditation practice, even though he was one of those people that continued to use other drugs. He said, mindfulness, if you want to try to meditate, I know how much you're suffering and it's so much of it's in your mind. You're okay right now. You're in jail. We'll see what's going to happen. But if you just bring your attention to your breath, he said, go back to your cell and try to, breathe in, count the breath, breathing in and breathe out, and try to ignore your mind and just practice this simple mindfulness of the breath. And it didn't make a lot of sense, the instruction didn't make a lot of sense, but I was desperate and I said, okay, I'll try it. And I went back into my cell and they got me out of the rubber room and into a normal cell. And I think actually one of the guards at this juvenile hall, and I'd been in that juvenile hall a lot of times, and he knew me, and he knew who my father was, and there was this little bit of like, why are you such a fuck up? Your dad writes these cool books. I went back to my cell and I tried mindfulness. I tried to pay attention to my breath. And I got some level of an immediate little tiny bit of relief, just a tiny bit, but I got it right away of like, oh wow, I can actually ignore my mind for a half a breath. I can actually get out of this where my mind is going to the future, prison, suffering, worst case scenario, or the past, all of this shame and guilt, and I can feel my breath, and feeling my breath is a relief. I'm not very good at it, I can't sustain it, I go right back into fantasy, but I can come back to my breath. And right in the beginning, mindfulness made sense to me, and it was something that I could do and that I could practice, and that time in juvie, Jason, who led our meditation this morning, he was in juvie with me that time, 1988. I knew Jason from the streets, although we were in a little bit of different cliques. I love to tell the story about one night I found Jason passed out at the bus stop, and I tried to see if he had anything in his pockets. And I was like, hey man, you okay? Just like digging through his pockets. He had like 3 lighters, that was it.
I had $20 in my shoe.
Not a thorough rolling. I was in juvie for about 2.5 months, and then sent to a group home. And I was 17 years old, and I was in this group home for about 6 months. Basically, they just said, we're going to keep you off of the streets until you turn 18. And while I was in the group home, I'd meditate a little bit. I was embarrassed about it. I'd lay down, pretend like I was asleep, and try to be mindful. And I hadn't had any real instruction other than that kind of simple instruction from my father over the phone. I got a therapist that knew a little bit about meditation. My father came to visit me. So I started to get a little bit more information about meditation. And this group home that I was in was not they didn't take us to meetings or anything. And I said, hey, I want to go to meetings. I want to go to AA. I met these guys in juvie. I want to go. And the group home was like, you're a fucking pain in the ass. You want to, they were not supportive at all of me wanting to recover. And this was like a state, group home. They gave us a carton of cigarettes. I think it must have been every other week we got a carton of cigarettes paid for by the state of California. Adolescents. The 80s weren't all bad. You can't even get smokes in prison anymore. The first couple of years I got out of the group home, I could just remember, I drank again while I was in the group home. I wasn't sure. I thought alcohol was different. Maybe I can have a couple of drinks. I won't show up in my piss test. Once I started drinking, I couldn't stop drinking. That sort of experiment, that compulsion, that alcoholism, where anything that I do overboard, and alcohol was the same. And I did start going to 12-step meetings, and in the beginning I didn't hate it. I felt like it was better than being in the group home. There was social, there was a big young people's group there. I didn't even, I thought that the philosophy was bullshit, but I didn't care because I wasn't there for the philosophy. I was there for, make some friends and, kind of meet some other people that weren't drinking. There was a bunch of punk rockers, and it was the fellowship, the community there was important. I think that also community is so important. I was also grateful that coming from the punk scene, having this whole subculture within the punk, this whole genre of drug-free punks, the straight edge movement, and that was so helpful to be able to identify with all of these punks that were not drinking and using. And that was, community, it was always something to identify with, has been always so important to me. And I can remember feeling in the beginning like, okay, if I'm sober, that's enough. I don't have to do the steps. I don't have to do, even the meditation was half-assed. And still feeling like there's got to be what I would consider a material solution rather than a spiritual solution. If I get the car, the girlfriend, the motorcycle, if I get the stuff, then I'll be happy. Then I'll be okay. If I can get out of this fucking group home, if I can get my own place, then I'll be happy. That sort of, it's out there, it's outside of me. And within a couple of years, I found myself, in my apartment, had a motorcycle, a car. I had a house full of stolen merchandise, a garage full of stolen motorcycle parts. I had all the stuff. I never sort of thought I had to earn it, but I got it. And I was meditating because I was so stressed out all of the time and so afraid and so much suffering still. And I think I was using meditation as an avoidance technique, but a useful avoidance technique in the beginning anyways. And at a couple of years sober, and having not really done the 12-step process very thoroughly and been pretty half-assed about my Buddhist practice, I ended up getting busted for graffiti and in some fairly serious trouble for vandalism, and had that maybe second level of shift of perspective, of clarity, and just saying like, okay, nothing worked, nothing outside of me worked. The drugs and alcohol didn't work, the stuff didn't work, the ego trip that I've been on, the straight edge, I'm better than everybody else trip didn't work. I'm miserable, and kind of that admission of misery. And that the only thing that has given me any relief is practice, is meditation practice. That's the only place that I found any real relief. I said, and I'm in AA, and these people are working the steps, and they seem to be happier than I feel. It looks like that anyways. And so I finally got a sponsor and really did the steps to the best of my ability, and my own sort of agnostic atheist approach to a very theistic methodology. But I said the prayers, and I did the inventories, and I did all of that. And I started going to meditation retreats at the same time and taking my Buddhist practice much more seriously. And I got some relief from prayer. I think even just the humility of asking, of surrendering, and of saying, I don't believe in you, but your will, not mine, be done. I know I'm talking to myself, but I surrender. And that was helpful. It was totally, there was a relief in prayer. And in the 4th step, and of sharing, I felt like I learned a lot from doing the 12 steps, and they were very useful to a point for me, for sure. I had a phase, I think, once I started doing the steps and going to retreats, and of getting the kind of spiritual pride experience of kind of going from spirituality and religion, it's all hippie bullshit, to I'm gonna get enlightened, this is good. Went on a retreat and started taking Buddhism more seriously, and started studying, and that kind of Unitarian, Universalist, we're all talking about the same thing, right? I started reading the Bible and reading the Quran and reading the Bhagavad Gita, and just really studying, there's the spiritual solution, what I'm going to go for it in that addictive way that we can. And my house was full, filled my house with the gurus and the statues and the you walk into my house and it's like a fucking ashram. And it was weird. It was a weird phase. Wearing a lot of white. Vegan. Gave up sugar, gave up caffeine, quit smoking, like total phase of purity. Took this vow of celibacy, was a sort of pseudo monk in my own punk rock way. And it was a pretty bad ego trip. Although I was serious about my practice, I was also very kind of competitive and judgmental and separate. I used spirituality to separate myself rather than to be connected. And I thought that maybe I'd become a monk, and that felt like some of my monastic teachers. I felt a pretty strong calling to that kind of liberation, especially through the period of celibacy where, not masturbating and not having sex, and this strong renunciation and feeling maybe as happy as ever. And even though the cravings would arise, I think I learned more about impermanence from celibacy than anything else, of just seeing like, okay, sexual thoughts, sexual feelings, and they arise and they pass. And but at some point, I went to Asia, and I fell in love and had this really messy relationship. And I went to Asia and thought like maybe I'll stay and I'll ordain. But when I was over there, I wasn't ready, and it was scary, and it was huge commitment. And I also felt like most of my teachers were householders and my father, and I just had this feeling that actually my place wasn't in the monastery, but my place was in the world, and that my practice was about being of service and eventually, hopefully having a family and parenting practice and relationship practice, and just felt like that was what was calling me, not the monastery, but an engaged spiritual practice in the world, in family, in relationship, with sexuality, with money and career and all of that stuff as my practice, not as some of the monastics would see it, as a distraction from practice, but actually as my practice. How you go till 10? And how much you need at the end? 10 minutes at the end? Or 5 minutes? 7 minutes? For a long time, I felt satisfied with having my recovery and my fellowship, my 12-step community, and my Buddhist practice and Buddhist community. And honestly, in Buddhism, I didn't really feel that connected to the community. I went to retreats and I met some great teachers, and I attended a lot of Buddhist groups, but I often felt like I was the only young person, the only tattooed person, the only cool person in the whole room. Honestly, that's how I felt. And I was happy, and in the fellowship and recovery, I had so many friends and hooligans to hang out with, and I felt satisfied with that for a long time. And as I began to teach Buddhism, as my teachers encouraged me to start teaching, there was a little bit of a decision to be made of like, was I going to do Buddhist recovery stuff, or was I just going to do Buddhist stuff? And it felt like an important decision at the time to make, that if I came out as a Buddhist recovery teacher, that I would get sort of typecast in that realm, and that I wouldn't be able to be of service to all of the non-addicts who also wanted to practice the Dharma. And so I made that decision to not be a recovery Buddhist, although, my story, of course it is, from Dharma punks forward, it's always been there, it's always been part of it, but not not explicitly, not that's what this is about, but that this is about awakening, this is about practice, and it's for all. Everyone has suffering, and everyone wants to be free from suffering. Some of us have the suffering of addiction, and that's why we seek practice and Dharma, but that's not true for everyone. Other people have different kinds of suffering. I don't know how long ago, maybe, to me it feels like about 10 years ago, maybe before that, I started to get the more Buddhist and more atheist and more just kind of strong in my own experience of the Dharma and just the God language, the Judeo-Christian, even the higher power, the powerlessness, all of that stuff. It just started to feel like this doesn't make sense. This is not my experience. This stuff isn't making sense to me anymore like it used to. And it's the Dharma, it's karma that's making sense, and it's personal responsibility, and it's transformation through our own efforts, and it's the Buddhist stuff is like, this is what really seems true to me, and I find myself in the 12-step rooms having to translate the stuff that's just not making sense into a way that does make sense to me, and started to do some of that Buddhism in the 12 steps, and here's a Buddhist way to look at the 12 steps. Kevin Griffin and I started doing that together, I think in 1999, so yeah, that's 16 years ago, I guess. And I was hoping that Kevin or one of the other Buddhist 12-steppers would, we created the Buddhist Recovery Network. How long ago, Mary? 7 years ago? 8 years ago?
7 years.
7 years ago, they said, okay, let's create this Buddhist Recovery Network. And I thought that what they were going to do is create Refuge Recovery. Like, okay, cool, we're going to do the Buddhist Recovery Network. We're going to do a Buddhist recovery path. I'm in. And then I joined this nonprofit. And they're like, oh, no, we're not going to create a program. We're just going to offer Buddhist resources to people in recovery, in 12-step recovery primarily. And I felt very dissatisfied with that. I said, I just feel like it's time for us as Dharma practitioners to step up and say, we don't have to keep talking about Buddhist principles and translating them through this Judeo-Christian model of the 12 steps. We don't have to do that. Buddhism on its own is an excellent treatment methodology, on its own. It has everything that we need to recover the Buddha's Dharma, everything we need. And although I really wanted it to happen, I have to be honest that I was a bit hesitant to do it myself. I didn't feel at that time, and I still at this time, I mean, it's too late now, but still at this time don't feel like I'm the ideal spokesperson for Buddhist recovery. Because of my appearance, because of my history of punk rock Buddhists, that even some of the early press on Refuge Recovery is like punk rock recovery, or and it's just not. It's not what it's about. Like this is traditional Buddhism, and I was talking to somebody just before this about how in their group there has been already the conflict of like, why does Noah's name have to be on it? And what I was saying is like, I agree. I don't really want my name on it either. Like, but the publisher wouldn't have put it out, and probably most of us wouldn't be here if I didn't put my name on it. And I couldn't think of a good way to get the Buddhist recovery thing out there into the world and really launched as a anonymous, unauthored book and program. But I wouldn't mind it, honestly. I mean, I feel mixed. I feel happy to be the spokesperson, to use my life's energy to help get this thing going. But I also feel like it's not my program. It's not, like this is traditional Buddhism. I didn't make any of this shit up. All I did was kind of form it. And I didn't even do that by myself. I did that with the help of a lot of people in our Against the Stream community as we created it. Is Joseph here? Joseph, who will be here at some point today, did a lot of the original questions for the inventory and put a lot of work into that. And Shannon and Mary and George Haas and there's a whole bunch of people in this community that created Refuge Recovery. As I say in the beginning of the book, that this is really a community. It's really a we that's doing it, but that I had to put my name on it. Really, I actually did all of the writing, but it was informed by the community. And I'm so I feel excited, but I also just feel really interested in what's going to happen with Refuge. Like it's an experiment. Like the fact that there's 90 or 100 meetings, the fact that there's 100 people here, that this is out there, that people are using it, that they're applying. I'm very happy, but I also feel like this is an experiment. Let's see what it's like in 5 years, in 10 years, in 20 years, in 50 years. Many of you are probably aware that Refuge Recovery came out on June 10th, which is also the anniversary of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And it was totally an accident, if you're superstitious like that and believe in accidents. It was actually supposed to come out in May, and they pushed the pub date. It was June 10th. And so Alcoholics Anonymous just celebrated 80 years of existence this week, and Refuge celebrated 1 year of existence. And so it'd be interesting to see what's going to be like in 80 years. Not that any of us will be here to see it, but that my hope actually is that we are creating something that will sustain, that will continue to offer a non-theistic, a meditative recovery approach to our generation and to the next generations. So I think I want to end with just asking you to consider Refuge Recovery your program, not mine. And whenever we can, we'll get my name off of it. I think that actually at some point it will be important to get my name off of it if we can. That having a personality associated with a recovery process, I don't think it's the best thing. And that what I feel like is this mixture of, okay, I wrote the book, here it is, and now actually it's your program, our program, I'm part of it too. I'd like to vote. But I don't want to make the decisions. I want the community to make the decisions, and that was a big part of us having this first conference and this annual conference. We need to figure out what we're going to do in Refuge Recovery. Are we going to have traditions? Aware that Alcoholics Anonymous didn't have traditions for the first 15 years. And, how soon can we get our traditions or guiding principles? That's what that guiding principles breakout group is about. What kind of traditions are we going to have? And it's probably necessary and useful. And how can the community come up with those? And as we come up with those kind of guiding principles of thinking about not our own personality and not our own, but like what will be good for the group? What will be good for the longevity to make Refuge Recovery a safe and sustainable and ongoing community of support. So I hope that you feel that way. People love to ask me questions about what should we do in our meeting, or what should we do in this or that, or they're fucking up over here, they're fucking up over there, and you need to do something about it. And I want to help. But I don't want to dictate what happens in Refuge Recovery. I think that Alcoholics Anonymous, I think that the structure of the 12 steps, the traditions, I think it's pretty brilliant. And the stuff around groups being autonomous, except for when it's going to fuck up the other groups. I think that's how they say it. I think that there's some brilliant things that we can learn from the recovery processes that have been out there, and some that we don't need. Some of the stuff we don't need, and some of us are so, been in the 12 steps for so long that it's so ingrained that that's the right way to do it. And I think it's important for us also to question: is it the right way? Is there a better way? Is there a healthier way? And that we can, without completely disregarding that, what can we learn from there, and how can we make our own mistakes, and maybe avoid some of the mistakes that have been made in the other recovery processes. And if I don't get high, the next couple months, I'll be coming up on 27 years, and I think that it's important too that a lot of it's just it's my recovery too, just like yours. Like we're all in this together, and I truly feel that way, and I hope that I come across that way, and I don't have all the answers. Thank you.